GAO says the Space Development Agency is at risk of falling behind on missile warning capability because of the technology readiness gaps and schedule planning weaknesses. The report also warns that users don't have enough transparency into how requirements are set, and DoD still lacks a reliable life cycle cost estimate. We'll walk through the details with GAO's John Ludwigson. Mr. Ludwigson, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for your interest in our work.
GAO has just done a deep dive on the Space Development Agency, which is a component of U.S. Space Force, looking at how they're estimating the technological readiness and the cost of several critical space elements. What's the big headline of this report before we dig into the details?
Well, I think when we look at SDA is charged with doing hard things. They're charged with this mission of trying to shift how we do missile warning, missile tracking. And that is a very important mission for all of the U.S. and our allies. But we think that they could improve how they're doing it in order to be more likely to achieve the outcomes they're striving for.
It sounds like there's a gap between some of their assumptions and the actual readiness of both the technology and the industry. How did you find that?
Well, I think you framed it well, which is that SDA is, as I said, charged with doing hard things, but the hard things require the technology to be ready. And what we found is that they're highly reliant on the contractor's estimate of technology readiness instead of conducting their own.
One of the things that really jumped out to me is that they have a plan to field new satellites every 2 years and replace them every 5 years. So when we think about industry readiness, that seems like a very aggressive timeline. Did your findings suggest that SDA's rapid acquisition cadence is realistic?
Well, I think one of the things that they're trying to do is to establish sort of the muscle memory in the industry that the government is going to buy and use these capabilities every 2 years. And launching objects every 2 years is an important component of iterative development, being able to integrate new technologies, being able to get those up on orbit and help the warfighter. That's a noble goal. What we found is that striving for that every 2 years doesn't really give you the opportunity to learn, which is one of the sort of precepts of why you want to do iterative development.
You can certainly imagine that the technology in this space is changing so rapidly that 2-year time frame would try to capture the most recent developments. But how does industry feel about that? Do they feel like they could actually support that kind of a timeline?
Well, I think industry likes the idea that there will be regular government contracts. Remember that some of the space development that's occurred in the past would take a very long time. So think 10 years, 15 years between contract awards for big capabilities that might be delivered. And that's hard for industry if you are the one who missed out on that contract. So the idea of every 2 years, there's going to be a new contract that's going to be available for bid, and multiple contractors might be awarded in that 2-year window is, I think, something that industry likes. I think the challenge is being able to do that under more fixed cost kinds of arrangements and being able to do that integrating technologies and perhaps trying to use commercial technologies but in slightly different ways poses a challenge for them.
And satellite launch really used to be the purview of NASA only. Does SDA have the capacity, the competencies to be able to move to something like that kind of schedule?
SDA is relying on commercial launch, right? So if you think of the going to the moon space age, that was certainly the purview of NASA. I think that launching satellites has been something that DoD has either done directly or indirectly through commercial launch. Today, commercial launch companies, think SpaceX, ULA, Blue Origin, those are the companies that are out there providing launch for DoD and others. They are the ones who would be supporting that 2-year launch cadence. But the integration of the satellites and being ready for launch is a challenge to do that every 2 years for sure.
One of the other gaps I think that the report raises is that the combatant commands, who will be the consumers of the satellite functionality, say they haven't really had a role in helping develop the requirements. Tell me more about GAO's assessment of that situation.
So as you know, I know you track our work pretty regularly. The requirements development process, typically it would be something that would be done on the DoD side. They would talk to people. They would go in the cave. They would write down the requirements of what the new system needed to do. what SDA has tried to do is they've established the Warfighter Council, which would work with SDA to develop those requirements. And the Warfighter Council includes combatant commands and the intelligence community and some other folks to try to come up with what the requirements might look like. What we found is that those meetings tended to be, from the perception of the not SDA Warfighter Council participants, they were presentations rather than sort of collaborative developments of those requirements.
And what difference does that make then as the programs may go forward?
Well, the warfighter is the one who ultimately needs this system in order to protect us all, right? So they need to understand, they need to make clear what they need in order to do their job, and they need to understand what the time frame is for various layers of that information to be available to them. And so what we found was that they didn't have that sort of involvement up front in creating the requirements, and they also weren't informed about what we refer to as the backlog, the things that aren't going to be in the next cycle but are slated for eventual insertion. And our leading practices say that you should really involve warfighters in that requirements development process and keep them informed as to whether their capability is going to be on the next iteration or where it's going to where it is in that backlog.
I'm speaking with John Ludwigson. He's Director, Contracting and National Security Acquisitions at GAO. Well, let's take a little bit of a different angle here. You looked at SDA's milestones and accomplishments, and you said they didn't really reflect underlying schedule risk. Walk us through that.
Well, I think when you think about doing the hard things that this SDA is charged with doing here, you have to recognize that it's going to take time in some cases in order to deliver this capability to the warfighter. And I believe what we found was that, in fact, those challenges were not being reflected in the schedule that they were looking at kind of going forward. So when you look at developing the tracking layer, which this is referred to as, there is the development of the underlying technologies and then the satellites and then getting those to launch. And we found that schedule didn't really reflect the realities of the technology development and the other steps that would be needed to put the capability on orbit.
How would they build a more integrated schedule that would support rational decision making?
Right now, we found that what they have is the compilation of the individual schedules that each contractor has, and they don't have an enterprise-wide or architecture-wide schedule that shows how all of those are interrelated. And so they don't have an idea that what the impacts are for a delay that might occur with one contractor and how that flows through the system. And keep in mind, the proliferated warfighter space architecture here includes the tracking layer, which we've talked about so far, but also the transport layer, which is the communication layer on how this data would be flowed to the ground.
Not only do they not have this integrated schedule, but the report points out that they don't really have good life cycle cost data about these systems either. So what does GAO recommend that they do to get a better assessment of the life cycle cost of what has got to be a very expensive program?
Well, I think that's right. This effort has been built around was the concept that we're going to leverage commercial products, and we're going to ask contractors to come forward with their bids, and that we will be a buyer of the best value, but the contractor is going to be delivering that. And because we were taking that approach, we weren't collecting data on what it costs. But as you alluded to in the beginning of our discussion, you need to replace these every 2 years. And as operating in low Earth orbit, which is where these operate, they actually will need to be deorbited. Each satellite will need to be deorbited about every 5 years. So this creates what we refer to as a must-pay bill. And it's fine to say that you're going to go to the grocery store and just buy milk, but because you need to replace these satellites every 2 years is when new tranches are going to be awarded, but every 5 years they're actually going to be deorbited and no longer available for doing their mission. We think it's really important that they understand what the cost drivers are to a greater extent than just accepting that they're going to buy whatever is available at whatever price the market provides.
Collectively in the report, GAO makes 6 recommendations. Which of those do you think is most urgent for SDA and its collaborators to take into effect so that they help minimize these risks?
Well, all of our recommendations are very important, I think. I do think it's very important to understand that from our perspective, iterative development offers a lot of promise, but it also has some steps that we think are probably most helpful to make sure you get the benefits of iterative development. And those are making sure that you have a good understanding of what the minimum viable product is as they move forward, understanding what the technology risks are, as we've alluded to in our discussion today, and then understanding what those costs are. I think that those elements are right there with respect to what you need to understand kind of going forward. So I believe SDA really has been tasked by the Congress and the president with doing hard things. And we just think there are opportunities to improve the likelihood that they're going to be successful on all of the things that they're charged with.
I've been speaking with John Ludwigson. He's Director of Contracting and National Security Acquisitions at GAO. Thanks for joining me today. As you said, this is really hard work.
Thank you so much for taking interest.
We'll post this interview and a link to the report at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts.